Oogenesis is the process by which oocytes or egg cells are created in the ovary, and of course ovulation is the process by which those oocytes are released from the ovary into the fallopian tube so that fertilization can occur. So we're going to keep this pretty basic. I don't want to get too deep into this, but there are a few things that we do need to cover. So let's get started. First of all, just to remind you that gametogenesis is the creation of the gametes. And of course there are two different types of gametes. There are sperm cells in the male and oocytes in the female. So both of these processes are created, or both of these processes involve meiosis. And as you saw earlier in discussions and in videos, that meiosis has two stages, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. So meiosis 2 here, meiosis 1 here. And the whole process is to divide the number of chromosomes so that you end up with gametes that have a total of 23 chromosomes, or simply one set of each of the chromosomes numbered 1 through 23. So for every spermatogonia that begins this process, you end up with 4 spermatids that will eventually become 4 functional sperm cells. However, with oogenesis, things are quite a bit differently. First of all, for every oogonium that begins the meiosis process, goes through meiosis 1, and then begins and may or may not complete meiosis 2, we end up with 1 functional egg cell and 3 waste products that are called polar bodies. Those polar bodies are simply a way to get rid of the extra sets of chromosomes that are not needed. So it's very important that we don't have those extra chromosomes in the oocyte that is potentially going to be fertilized. Else you would end up with too many chromosomes and it wouldn't be a viable pregnancy. So I mentioned meiosis 2 may or may not complete. In the male, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 always goes to completion and creates those 4 spermatogonia, or 4, I'm sorry, not spermatogonia, but 4 spermatids. In the female, meiosis 2 is only going to complete if that egg that has been ovulated is fertilized. Otherwise, the egg cell will never finish meiosis 2, and then it will be shed in the monthly menstrual flow. So let's talk a little bit now about what's going on with this entire process. I'm sorry, I thought both of those were on the same page. Let's look first at this particular slide, and you can see here is an ovary, and we begin this whole process with primordial follicles. These are created long before birth, and those primordial follicles are then going to develop into structures known as primary follicles. Now the follicle, just as you saw with the thyroid gland, is a container. So the follicle is made up of follicular cells around the outer edge, and then on the inside of that follicle we have the oocyte. So in here we have the oocyte, and on the outside we have the follicle. That follicle is going to continue to get larger, and here we still have a primary oocyte, but it's a little bit larger. Now, as the female ages, and we're going to get a little bit deeper into this in just a minute, those primary follicles are going to become secondary and mature follicles, and inside there, that primary oocyte is going to become a secondary oocyte. So you can see the follicle has got much bigger here, and there is a fluid-filled space on the inside that's known as the antrum. And each month, under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, those follicles will continue to develop, and then the most mature of all of those follicles under the influence of luteinizing hormone is going to ovulate that secondary oocyte. That secondary oocyte is now out in the fallopian tubes waiting to be fertilized, and we're left with an empty follicle. That empty follicle is going to become a structure known as the corpus luteum, which literally translates to mean yellow body, because that's how it appears if you look at it under the microscope. That's U-E-M, sorry about that. So your corpus luteum is here, and it is going to secrete estrogen and progesterone. That estrogen and progesterone are going to work together to prepare the uterus for a potential pregnancy. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this. Okay, so you can see here, we're beginning before birth. We have the stem-like cells that are the oogonia that are going to undergo mitosis to create more oogonia. And then before birth, all of the primary oocytes, or the primary eggs, remember oocytes are eggs, are going to be found in primary follicles, or in the primordial follicles and the primary follicles, and secondary follicles. So this is, of course, before birth. So you're going to have primary oocytes. So even though the follicles are beginning to mature, the oocytes are still primary oocytes. After birth, things start to change. Okay, so now we're talking about once this person has reached the age of puberty. So these follicles are going to become mature. Okay, so mature or Grothian follicles are going to contain a primary oocyte until just before ovulation, when meiosis 1 is going to complete. So we're dividing now that number of chromosomes, and we're creating a polar body over here that's going to simply be a waste product. Now, under the influence of luteinizing hormone, ovulation is going to occur. So that secondary oocyte, the oocyte is going to be released out into the fallopian tube where fertilization may occur. If fertilization does occur, that oocyte is then going to continue and complete meiosis 2. All right, and create another polar body. All right, let's continue on. And that's what we just talked about. So let's look at now the role of the hormones in this. Now remember back when you did the endocrine system, you learned a lot about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So we're going right back to those same two structures to begin this conversation. So your hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which targets the anterior pituitary, which then releases follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So we're releasing a whole lot of follicle-stimulating hormone here at number 2, and a little bit of luteinizing hormone. Those hormones are going to travel down to the target cells in the ovary and stimulate the development of those follicles. So the follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the follicles to mature. Those follicular cells around the outer edge are going to secrete estrogen. So the larger the follicle, the more estrogen that will be released. So the estrogen then, at low levels, is going to have an inhibitory effect on the further release of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So these low levels of estrogen tell the anterior pituitary, don't release more of these hormones, but I want you to make a whole lot of it. So it's sort of like you can imagine your car. If your car is in park and you step on the accelerator, you're revving up the engine, but you're not getting anywhere. So these low levels of estrogen are basically telling the pituitary gland, I want you to make a whole lot of luteinizing hormone and make me a little more follicle-stimulating hormone, but don't dump it out. All right, so now let's go back down here and look at this follicle. It's getting bigger and bigger, which means more and more and more follicular cells, which are going to secrete more and more and more estrogen. So those higher levels of estrogen then go right back up and tell the anterior pituitary, dump out all of that luteinizing hormone and that follicle-stimulating hormone. So now we've got massive amounts of luteinizing hormone, a little bit more follicle-stimulating hormone that travels right back down to the ovary and causes ovulation to occur. So that mature follicle now releases that oocyte, then that empty follicle becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then secretes estrogen and progesterone, which help to maintain the uterus, and also a chemical known as inhibin. So these three all together have an inhibitory effect, as illustrated here by the dotted line, on the anterior pituitary. Now, why would we want to be inhibiting the anterior pituitary? I knew you knew the answer to that. Of course, you don't want to mature another follicle and then ovulate another oocyte when you've already got one out here in the fallopian tube waiting to be fertilized. Okay, now if fertilization doesn't occur, that corpus luteum is going to become the corpus albicans. Albicans means white. The corpus albicans is basically scar tissue. It can't make these hormones, so your estrogen and progesterone levels fall, your inhibin levels fall, so the pituitary is no longer being inhibited, and it starts over by releasing more follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, I know that sounded pretty complicated, but walk yourself through each step of this and really get to understand this, because this is some of the most important parts of the female reproductive cycle. All right, let's move on. Let's see where we're headed next. Oh, we've already done that one. Let's go the other direction. Okay, now, let's tie all these events together. Remember, we've been talking about estrogen and progesterone. So here we're looking at your estrogen and progesterone levels in the bloodstream. Up here, we're talking about follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in the bloodstream. Here, of course, we're talking about what's going on in the ovary. And then down here, we're talking about what's going on in that endometrium, or the inner lining of the uterus. Okay, now think about what we started with. Okay, we started with a cycle that goes from ovulation to getting that oocyte out there, and if the oocyte gets fertilized, then a pregnancy is going to occur, and if the pregnancy doesn't occur, then we're going to have the monthly menses or the menstrual flow, because we prepared that uterus for implantation. Well, day one of the menstrual cycle is the first day of the menses, or the first day of menstruation, what we commonly call a period. So at day one, we're slopping off the lining of that uterus. Okay, so what's happening? If we're having that menses, we know that we didn't fertilize an egg. Okay, so we've got to get rid of all of that buildup. Well, we said that the corpus luteum is going to secrete estrogen and progesterone, which are going to cause when those levels go up, it's going to cause the uterus to get thick and gooey. So if we're shedding the lining, that means that our estrogen and progesterone levels have decreased. If our estrogen and progesterone levels have decreased, that means the corpus luteum is no longer making estrogen and progesterone. So if your estrogen and progesterone levels have decreased, then you're going to slowly start increasing your follicle-stimulating hormone and your luteinizing hormone. Because remember, it's the estrogen and the progesterone and the inhibin from your corpus luteum that prevents them from being released. Okay, so let's go back and tie this together. We're at day one. So we've just started the menses. We're shedding the uterine lining. So that means our estrogen and progesterone levels are falling. That means we're not inhibiting our follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, so they can start to rise. Okay, those rising levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are going to cause the follicles to mature. As the follicles mature, they are secreting more and more estrogen, so your estrogen levels start to rise. Now remember, those low levels of estrogen ramp up the production, but prevent the release of more FSH and LH until that follicle gets really big. Okay, that follicle gets really big, it causes the pituitary gland to dump out that luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Now let's back up and look down here at what's going on at the uterus. As those estrogen and progesterone levels are increasing, you see there are new blood vessels being formed in the uterus. Okay, you see the glands are getting bigger. Okay, so we're secreting a glycogen-rich mucus, adding in a lot more of a blood supply there. The lining's getting thicker and thicker. Estrogen levels continue to rise. Your LH triggers ovulation. So let's change colors now and go with blue. We're going to ovulate. Okay, so our LH levels spiked here right before day 14. Okay, so we look here. Right before day 14, our luteinizing hormone levels spike. That stimulates ovulation to occur. Now that oocyte is out in the fallopian tubes waiting to be fertilized. All right, so we form the corpus luteum. Now, initially, your estrogen levels will drop a little bit until that corpus luteum forms completely. then your estrogen and progesterone levels jump up because corpus luteum is making them, which causes more buildup of the endometrium, even more thick, gooey mucus, even more blood vessels to be made, because we just might have a baby made, right? So if that oocyte gets fertilized, then that uterus is ready for it. So your rising levels of estrogen and progesterone inhibit further release of FSH and LH. If pregnancy occurs, we form a structure known as a one-celled zygote that's going to create a two-celled structure and then become a four-celled structure, and so on until you end up with a ball of cells known as a morula. Now that morula is then going to create a structure known as a blastocyst. So the blastocyst is going to have an outer ring of cells and an inner cell mass. Okay, so that inner cell mass is going to make the baby. That outer ring of cells is known as the trophoblast. Okay, that trophoblast is going to secrete HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. Now, this is what you detect when you pee on a stick, but that's not why it's there. That trophoblast secretes human chorionic gonadotropin because it tells the corpus luteum not to degenerate. Remember, the corpus luteum secretes the estrogen and progesterone that keeps that uterus ready for pregnancy, ready for implantation. So if you have a trophoblast, it secretes HCG. HCG maintains the corpus luteum. Isn't the body amazing? I think this is such a really, really cool thing that happens. Now, later on during the pregnancy, that trophoblast is going to embed into the walls of the endometrium. So that trophoblast is going to hang out right there and start extending little chorionic villi into the endometrium, and that will form the placenta. So you're going to have tissues coming in from the let's go with a different color. So we'll have tissues coming in here from the endometrium, and then you've got those chorionic villi coming from the trophoblast, and all of that is going to form the placenta. Now, once that placenta is fully formed, those trophoblastic cells have become chorionic cells. They're not going to be secreting human chorionic gonadotropin, so there's nothing maintaining that corpus luteum anymore. But the good thing is, by that time, the placenta has already fully formed, and that placenta takes over the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, which once again come right back down here and maintain that uterus. Pretty cool stuff, huh? Yeah, I thought so too. Okay, I think that may be all that I have on this. Let me check to make sure I don't have another slide here. Once again, this is a pretty sticky topic, but if you really think about the things that we've talked about and you are able to follow along how the hormones play a role in all of this, this will start to make more sense to you. This is a pretty easy to understand once you get the hang of it. So take some time and walk yourself through all of these hormones and what's going on, and be able to relate how the hormones are related to each other, as well as what's going on in the uterus and the ovaries. If you have any questions, feel free to give me an email or give me a call, and I will be talking with you all again soon. Have a wonderful day.